I never thought my own parents would look me in the eye and tell me that my children weren't welcome in their home. But that's exactly what happened. It started with a phone call, just weeks before Thanksgiving. I was standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while my kids giggled in the next room, completely unaware that in just a few seconds, their grandparents would shatter a piece of their world. When I picked up, my mother's voice was light, almost cheerful. Too cheerful. That was my first red flag. "Hey, honey," she said. "We need to talk about Thanksgiving." For a moment, I felt that familiar warmth. No matter how many times I had felt like the afterthought in our family, I still clung to the traditions, to the memories of family gathered around the table, passing dishes, laughing. My kids adored their grandparents, and despite the strain that had built up over the years, I thought they did too. "What's the plan?" I asked, already picturing the golden turkey, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the house, the fireplace crackling in the background. There was a pause, a hesitation just long enough to send a small chill down my spine. Then my mother cleared her throat. "This year, we're doing things a little differently," she said, in that cautious, calculated way people talk when they know they're about to say something you won't like. I tightened my grip on the spoon. "Oh?" "It's going to be smaller. Just adults, a more intimate dinner." I frowned. "No kids at all?" Another pause, then, more hesitantly this time. "Well, no, not exactly." Something in me bristled. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly colder. I had known for years that my parents favored my brother, Daniel, and his children. It was always little things, subtle comments, the way they lit up around his kids in a way they never quite did with mine. But now, it wasn't subtle. Now they weren't even pretending. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sharper than before. She let out a sigh, the kind she always did when I wasn't blindly accepting whatever she said, like I was being difficult for daring to question her decisions. "Allie," she said, her voice adopting that careful, patronizing tone, "we love your kids, we really do. But they can be energetic. And honestly, we just think it would be better if you left them with a sitter this year." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "Just my kids?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it from her. She hesitated, and then finally, she admitted it. "Daniel and Sophie are coming, with their boys." The words landed like a slap. Daniel, the golden child, the perfect son, the one who could do no wrong, no matter how many mistakes he made, the one they bent over backwards for while I was left scrambling for scraps of approval, and his kids, oh, they were angels in their eyes, polite, quiet, refined. Unlike mine. The weight of it all hit me at once. The school plays they had attended for Daniel's kids while making excuses for why they couldn't make it to my daughter's recital. The way Christmas morning always meant a mountain of presents for my nephews while my own children got something small. An afterthought. The way they never missed a birthday party for Daniel's family, but for mine? "Oh, we're so busy this weekend, sweetheart. Maybe next year." I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "They're just children," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emma is 7. Lucas is 4. Of course they have energy, but they love you." "We just want a peaceful evening," my mother replied, her tone clipped now, irritated that I wasn't simply accepting her decision. "It's not personal." "Not personal." I let out a small, bitter laugh. "It's not personal?" I repeated, my throat tightening. "You're telling me that my kids aren't welcome, but Daniel's are. How is that not personal?" "Allie, don't be dramatic," she sighed. "It's just one dinner. You and Liam are still invited, of course." Like that was supposed to make it better. Like I was supposed to leave my children at home, sit at a table with the people who had just rejected them, and pretend everything was fine. I took a slow, shaky breath. "No, Mom," I said. "If my kids aren't welcome, then neither am I." There was a long silence, then a sharp exhale, like she was the one being wronged. "Suit yourself." And then she hung up. I stood there, staring at the phone, my breath unsteady. In the next room, Emma and Lucas were still laughing, still building their pillow fort, completely unaware that their grandparents, the ones they adored, had just decided they weren't good enough. Something inside me broke. I had spent years trying to earn my parents' approval, bending over backwards to fit into a mold they had never designed for me, And for what? So they could remind me, yet again, that I would never be their priority? That my children, my perfect, wonderful children, were less than? A lump formed in my throat. I had a choice to make, and I wasn't about to let my children grow up feeling like I had my entire life, like they had to fight for love that should have been given freely. I wasn't doing this anymore. They had made their choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. I woke up the next morning, my head still heavy from the conversation with my mother. For a moment, I let myself hope it had all been a bad dream, but then I glanced at my phone and saw the call log. The last words my mother had spoken to me still ringing in my ears. "Suit yourself." I sat up, rubbing my temples as the weight of it all pressed down on me again. A part of me had expected, no, hoped, that she would call back. That maybe, just maybe, she'd realize how cruel she had been and apologize. But deep down, I knew better. They weren't going to call. They weren't going to take it back, because in their eyes, they had done nothing wrong. I pulled the blanket off and swung my legs over the side of the bed, listening to the quiet hum of the house. In the next room, I could hear Emma and Lucas chattering to each other, their voices light, happy, unaware of the storm raging in my heart. I should have felt relieved that they didn't know, but all I felt was sorrow, because one day, they would. One day they would realize what I had been forced to accept my entire life. That love in our family was conditional, that my parents had a favorite, and that no matter how much we tried, how much we loved them, we would always come second, unless I did something about it. I took a deep breath, pushing myself up from the bed. My phone buzzed just as I was stepping into the hallway. Daniel, of course. I stared at his name flashing on the screen, my stomach twisting. I already knew what this was about. Mom had run to him, spun the story in her favor, painted me as the villain. I hesitated for only a second before swiping to answer. "Allie," he said, skipping any kind of greeting. "Mom said you're making a big deal out of this Thanksgiving thing." I clenched my jaw. "She uninvited my kids, Daniel." He sighed like I was exhausting him. "She didn't uninvite them. She just made it clear that your kids are more important than mine?" I snapped. Silence. I knew that silence. It was the same one he had given me our whole lives when he knew I was right, but would never admit it. "Look," he said finally, "they just want a peaceful dinner." I let out a bitter laugh. "A peaceful dinner? Right. And my kids, what? Disrupt their perfect little world? Is that it?" "You know how they are, Allie," he said, his tone shifting. "They're a lot." The words landed like a slap. They were a lot. That's how he saw them, how they all saw them, like a burden, like something to be tolerated, not cherished. Something inside me snapped. "You know what, Daniel?" I said, my voice sharp and steady. "Enjoy your perfect little Thanksgiving, but I won't be there." Allie dash. I hung up before he could finish. And just like that, the decision was made. I wasn't going. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to fight to be included. I was done. A strange kind of calm settled over me as I walked into the living room where my kids were sprawled on the floor, coloring together. They looked up at me with bright, eager faces, completely oblivious to the storm that had just passed. I sat down beside them, running my fingers through Emma's hair. "How do you two feel about making our own Thanksgiving this year?" Lucas's eyes widened. "With turkey. And pie?" Emma added. I smiled, pulling them both into a hug. "With whatever we want." Their excitement was instant. They launched into ideas: mac and cheese, cupcakes, chocolate turkey, Lucas's very specific request. And as I sat there listening, I realized something. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't mourning the loss of Thanksgiving with my parents, because what I had, right here in this living room, was worth more than anything I had been fighting for. Thanksgiving morning arrived, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't in a long, long time. Peace. No rushing to get the kids into their best clothes. No stress over arriving on time. No anxious glances at the clock. Instead, I woke up to the sound of giggles coming from the kitchen. I stepped out of bed and found Liam with the kids, all three of them covered in flour as they attempted to make pancakes. Liam grinned sheepishly when he saw me. "I think we may have used too much batter." I laughed, shaking my head. "There's no such thing as too much pancake batter." We spent the morning in a way I never had before, completely free from the weight of my parents' expectations. Emma and Lucas helped decorate the table, covering it with hand-drawn place cards and little paper turkeys they had made the night before. Liam played music in the background, twirling the kids around the kitchen while I put the finishing touches on our meal. And when we finally sat down to eat, I looked around at my family, and realized something. I had spent my whole life trying to prove my worth to people who would never see it. But sitting at that table, surrounded by laughter and love, I finally understood. I didn't need their approval. I never did. But just as I took a deep breath, ready to move on, my phone lit up with a text from my mother. "I hope you're happy with yourself. You ruined Thanksgiving." I stared at the words, my fingers tightening around the phone. Of course they couldn't just let it go. Because this was never about Thanksgiving. It was about control. And now that I had taken that away from them, they weren't going to let me go without a fight. I didn't respond to my mother's text. For the first time in my life, I left her words hanging in the air with no reply, no apology, no desperate attempt to smooth things over. I placed my phone face down on the counter, took a deep breath, and went back to my family. Because that's what they were. My family. Not the people who saw my children as an inconvenience. Not the people who measured love in levels of obedience. Not the ones who expected gratitude for every small kindness while demanding silence about their cruelty. No, my family was here, at this table. Laughing, eating, building new traditions, without any of the suffocating expectations that had weighed me down my entire life. And yet, even as I soaked in the warmth of the moment, there was something lingering in the back of my mind. A quiet voice that whispered, "Is this it? Is this really the end?" Because the thing about family, the thing no one ever warns you about, is that walking away isn't just one moment. It's not just one fight, one decision. It's a series of choices, again and again, every time they try to pull you back in. And I knew my parents well enough to know this wasn't over. That night, after we put the kids to bed, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying years of moments I had once brushed aside. The way my mother always sighed when I talked about my kids, but lit up when Daniel mentioned his. The way my father barely remembered Emma's birthday, but took Daniel's sons on yearly fishing trips. The way I had spent my entire life making excuses for them. Maybe they're just old-fashioned. Maybe they don't realize what they're doing. Maybe if I try harder, they'll see us differently. But sitting there in that quiet house, with my husband's arm draped around my shoulder and the echoes of my children's laughter still lingering in the air, I saw the truth. They had always known what they were doing. They just thought I'd never walk away. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my mother. It was Daniel. "Mom and Dad are really upset. Why do you always have to make everything dramatic?" I let out a breath and stared at the message for a long time. Then I started typing. They told me my kids weren't welcome. That's not my drama. That's theirs. The typing bubbles appeared, then stopped, then appeared again. "You're overreacting. They just wanted a quiet dinner. You know how your kids can be." There it was. Again. That same unspoken rule our family had always lived by. Daniel's children were well behaved. Mine were too much, and I was expected to just accept it. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply before I typed my final response. You know what's funny? They always said the same thing about me when we were kids, that I was too much, too loud, too emotional, too difficult. But what they really meant was that I wouldn't fall in line the way you did. No response. I set my phone down, feeling lighter than I had in years. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? It was never really about my kids, it was about control. It was about keeping me in my place, and I wasn't playing along anymore. The next few weeks were quiet. My parents didn't call. Daniel didn't text again. And for the first time in my life, I had a taste of freedom. At first, it felt strange, like walking through an empty house after years of living in a crowded one. I had spent so long being at their beck and call that I didn't know what to do with the silence. But as the days passed, I started to see it for what it really was. Peace. No more walking on eggshells. No more feeling like my children had to prove they were worthy of love. No more questioning if I was being too sensitive when my gut told me otherwise. I wasn't fighting for scraps of affection anymore. I was building something better. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat on the porch with Liam, the cool autumn air wrapping around us. He looked at me over his mug of tea. "How are you feeling?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Then I smiled. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "Not just pretending good?" I shook my head. Number really good. Because I had finally realized something I should have known years ago. Family isn't about obligation. it's not about blood ties or traditions you force yourself to follow out of guilt. It's about who shows up for you. It's about the people who love you without conditions. And this was family. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought back to every Thanksgiving I had spent trying to impress my parents, trying to win a game that was always rigged against me. And then I thought about today, the laughter, the warmth, the feeling of belonging without having to earn it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I didn't need it. I never did. The first time I saw my parents after Thanksgiving, it wasn't by choice. It had been over a month since that phone call, since my decision, since I had drawn a line in the sand and refused to step back over it. Christmas was creeping up, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't preparing for a chaotic, guilt-ridden holiday spent at my parents' house. No rushing to buy gifts that wouldn't be appreciated. No mentally preparing myself for the subtle digs and backhanded compliments. Just peace, or at least that's what I thought. Until I ran into my mother at the grocery store. I had Lucas sitting in the cart, kicking his little legs happily as we browsed the baking aisle. Emma was holding my hand, talking about what kind of cookies we should make for Santa, when suddenly I heard it. That voice. Allie. I froze. It had been so long since I'd heard my mother's voice in person that for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then I turned, and there she was. Standing there, hands on her hips, with that same disapproving look she had always given me as a child. I should have expected it. We lived in the same town. It was bound to happen eventually. But I had been enjoying my quiet little life so much that I had almost forgotten she existed. Mom, I said it coolly, casually, as if my stomach wasn't twisting into knots. She sighed, tilting her head like I was some unruly child she had to scold. Are you really not coming to Christmas? I stared at her. Was she serious? After everything? I let out a short, humorless laugh. No, Mom, I'm not. She folded her arms. This is ridiculous, Allie. Family forgives each other. Family respects each other, I shot back. And you made it clear exactly where we stand. Her lips pressed together. You're really going to do this over one little misunderstanding? I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You uninvited my children, Mom. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice. And now I'm making mine. Her eyes darted down to Lucas, still happily kicking his feet in the cart, oblivious to the tension in the air. Oh, sweetheart, she said to him, her voice suddenly dripping with forced warmth. Grandma misses you so much. I bristled. The audacity. The nerve to act like she was some loving grandmother, when just weeks ago, she had deemed him unworthy of a seat at her table. I stepped between them slightly, blocking her from reaching for him. No, I said firmly. You don't get to do that. You don't get to ignore them when it's inconvenient and then play the loving grandma when it suits you. Her face twisted into something ugly, something I had seen too many times before. You're being cruel, she hissed. I am still your mother. And I am their mother, I countered. And my job is to protect them from people who make them feel less than, even if those people are family. Her jaw tightened, and then, just like that, she straightened, smoothing out her coat like she had just realized other people were in the aisle, watching. She forced a tight smile. Well, she said, her voice suddenly light again, I hope you'll come to your senses before Christmas. Daniel and the boys will be there, of course. It'll be lovely. I didn't take the bait. I just smiled, really smiled, so big it almost hurt. That sounds perfect for you, Mom. Enjoy. And then I turned the cart and walked away. She didn't call after me. She didn't follow. She just stood there. And for the first time, I felt the power shift. She wasn't rejecting me anymore. I was rejecting her. That Christmas was the best I'd ever had. There was no tension, no dread, no walking on eggshells, just laughter and warmth and freedom. Emma and Lucas opened their presents in their pajamas, faces full of wonder. Liam made hot cocoa, humming Christmas songs under his breath while I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched my children just be kids, without judgment, without expectation. And I realized something then, something so simple, yet so freeing. I never had to go back. I never had to accept their scraps of affection. I never had to settle for being an afterthought. I had been chasing my parents' approval my entire life, but the truth was, I had always been enough. I just needed to stop seeking validation from people who would never give it. Months passed, and the silence stretched on. and I thrived in it. And then I went to my daughter's dance recital, and she ran into my arms after, beaming, knowing I had been there. I played superheroes with my son, and he never had to wonder if he was too much, because in my home, he was perfect just as he was. I built a life where love wasn't conditional, where family meant belonging, not obligation. And I realized something else. The chosen ones weren't the ones my parents had handpicked. The real chosen ones were the people I surrounded myself with. The people who showed up. The people who loved me, loved us, without strings attached. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing after a love that would never come. I was giving all my love to the people who deserved it. And I had never been happier.